World Map is the latest update to hit Iron Harvest, and it brings a whole new game mode that is essentially a sandbox grand campaign. We have 3 maps for this new game mode, as well as a boatload of different scenarios, and I'm going to break down exactly how it works so you can dive back into this underrated gem of a strategy game. Also, this video is sponsored by the devs. All opinions I state in this video are my own, so if you think I'm being too nice just because they sent me my very own mech, you're wrong. But if you want me to be a bit nicer, you can always send me another one, preferably a Steinmutter. Anywho, let's get into this new game mode and exactly how it works. When setting up your game, you have the choice of 3 maps: Divided Continents, Archipelago, and the Sheer Land. The only difference between the maps is obviously the layout and how hard they are to get around and capture victory points. Each map also has 3 different scenarios, as well as having the option to set up a custom scenario. Each scenario is explained in their own little blurb, and some are for sure harder than others, but when it comes to the actual gameplay, they all function the exact same. You can choose your faction and difficulty before loading in, and can play as whoever you want in every campaign, so it can get quite a bit of replay value if you like testing all the factions. Also worth noting, no matter which faction you pick, you'll always start in the same location. So don't think just because you pick Usonia and Saxony start with all this land, if you pick Saxony, you'll start with the land. No, you start in the same place with the same number of armies and the same amount of land every single time. Upon loading in, you are shown your victory conditions, and most of the time it's get a certain number of victory points or destroy all enemy capitals. Victory points are these stars you can see everywhere, and you can tell how many everyone has by looking at the numbers under their flags. You gain more victory points by taking locations on the map, and similarly lose them if you lose locations. Every location has a number of stars, a level of strength, and an amount of income. The stars are of course how many victory points you gain for owning that location. The strength is how powerful the defensive army is, and therefore how hard it will be to take over. This can be upgraded using currency by up to 2 points every turn. Armies also have a strength rank, and while you can beat a higher strength force, most of the time it'll cause you a lot more casualties, especially if you auto-resolve, so be very careful when attacking. And finally, income determines how much currency you gain per turn while owning that region, and you can see your total change per turn in the top left. Currency can then be used to add new units to your army, increase army capacity, research new units. A little side note about researching new units: you can either do it from the unit recruitment menu, in which case you have to pay some money, and then it'll take a couple of turns for the unit to be researched, or you can take certain locations on the map, and if you hover over the unit, it'll tell you what location you need to take to unlock it, fortify locations, and pays for the upkeep of current units. By the way, one super easy tip for saving money on upkeep: units can be recruited instantly, so don't recruit unless you're fighting in that same turn, otherwise you'll be paying upkeep on units to sit there and do nothing. Now, any Matt Murdochs in the audience watching with supersonic hearing might have heard me say the word turn, and yes, this game mode introduces turn-based strategy to the game. Now, unlike most turn-based games, each turn in this game mode is separated into 2 halves: the preparation phase and the combat phase. In the prep phase, you can move your armies around the map, develop your armies, and fortify your lands. When moving armies, they can move much further across your owned areas, but can only move to adjacent enemy locations, so you can't dive from one end of the world to the other, then straight into hostile territory. You have to get on your border, and then move into it the next turn. In the combat phase, you can take part in any combat your armies are involved in, whether offensive or defensive. Defense only happens if your army is in your own lands and an enemy force moves in. Offense of course occurs when you move your army into hostile territory. In either case, you are given a combat scenario, and there are a bunch of options here of what you can be doing. It can be something simple like destroying an enemy base or capturing a victory point. It can be destroying all enemy units on the map, taking strategic locations to accumulate victory points, or surviving waves, and much more. Each of these scenarios can also have certain rules, like not being able to deploy certain types of units, like mechs or very heavy mechs for example. It's worth reading up on this, as if you move in with a full mech army and you can't deploy any of them, you'll still lose even though you have a much more powerful army. Whatever it is, you can choose to manually fight or auto-resolve. When auto-resolving, you get a breakdown of your chances of victory and predicted casualties, so make sure you're happy with the chance and cost of victory before taking the easy way. If you're victorious in combat, you'll conquer any land you're attacking or maintain control of any land you're defending. You'll also have to choose which units to bring back from combat, as you'll only have as much budget as you put in, meaning if your troops change weapons and become more expensive, you'll have to leave some behind after combat's finished. Once this is all done for every faction, the turn will end and the next one will begin, and this happens again and again until you win or are taken out. Alongside your regular victory objectives, you'll also receive side objectives such as taking certain territories, sacking certain factions, and so on. Completing these side objectives will grant you various rewards such as currency and free units to recruit into any army you please. You can even get units from factions other than your own, which is great for some variety, but even more devastating when you lose them, as you cannot replace them. Of course, doing this would be too much for any single army to take care of, so over the course of the game, you can unlock up to 2 armies, each led by heroes from your faction. You unlock these by acquiring a certain percentage of the victory points needed to beat the campaign, and you can see the exact number by hovering over the menu at the top of the screen. Try to rush high value areas as soon as possible to get more armies on the go, as it really does make things so much easier. Now, my best advice for any campaign is focusing on the highest gains for the lowest costs, and yeah, that seems really obvious, but it can really get you ahead super fast if you do it right. For example, given the choice between a strength 5 that has 20 income and a strength 3 that has 20, of course you go for the lowest strength since it's the same gains. But also plan ahead. If that 3 strength leads nowhere, you're going to waste a turn moving back into position, whereas the 5 strength might lead you to more areas beyond, so it might have more value beyond what the numbers say on the screen. Plan your attack a couple of moves ahead and adapt to what enemies do. You have the benefit of seeing exactly what moves every other army is going to make before moving your own, so if you see an opportunity to take land from right under their nose, go for it. Once you get enough land under your control, you don't really need to worry about this and can just look for the easiest paths to take to push enemies even further behind you. I also mentioned earlier that each faction has a capital. If you take out a faction's capital, all of their territory becomes neutral and they are completely removed from the game. So protect yours at all costs and see if you can get an easy win by taking one out. Even if they own all the land on the entire map, taking out the capital will mean everything goes to neutral and they lose all their armies. Another obvious tip is try to avoid mass casualties as much as possible, since upkeeping units is pretty cheap, but building an entirely new army, especially with late game units, can be extremely costly, so losing the entire thing in seconds does not feel even slightly good. And finally, fortify as regularly as you can comfortably afford, but do it right. There's not a lot of point upgrading the strength of your capital when there are like 7 areas between it and the closest enemy. Fortify your borders to try and keep them at levels similar to enemy armies, so you're always ready for an attack. If you take an area and it's drastically lower strength, then upgrade it every turn until it's up to standard. If you do all this, you should find your way to a dubski before you know it. And that's just about everything you need to know about the new world map game mode in Iron Harvest. Like I said at the start, this is sponsored, but Iron Harvest is definitely a lot of fun, has a great story mode as well as skirmishing, a little bit of a multiplayer scene, granted it doesn't have the most players, but it's still a lot of fun. Anyways, that is all from me. If you enjoyed this video and or found it useful, consider leaving it a like and maybe subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. I'm hoping to hit 50k by the end of the year, so I sure would appreciate the assistance. If you're feeling especially big penis and want to support the channel directly, you can become a member here on YouTube or a patron on the Patreon. Doing so gets you early insights into future content, discounts on merch, and shoutouts at the end of videos, just like Henry Tucker for his support at the officers tier. Huge thank you to all supporters, and one last thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.